Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Words of Life podcast, our weekly recap from the last 6 days of our reading. This last week, we read chapters 11 through 18 of the book of Matthew. And Kevin and I are getting together to just kind of unpack it a little bit, highlight some of the things that we found super interesting, maybe some new observations along the way. And we hope you really enjoy it. All right, so let's dive right in and... we'll hit up starting with chapter 11, which starts with an interesting passage. I actually ended up doing more of a deep dive myself into the limited commission, which was in chapter 10, right? And I found that super interesting, how many lessons there were from that, so much so that I altered my sermon for Sunday, and I included a whole section about the limited commission. And I called it the on-the-job training for the apostles.
Sure.
Because when Jesus called them, he said, I'm going to make you fishers of men. Right? And so Jesus actually, he's got this program. Hey, you guys are going to go.
Here's what you're going to do.
You're going to go do it now.
Yeah.
You won't be alone. You'll be two of you together. But it was a non-profit organization, right? Not for profit.
That's right.
You're going to get out there and you're going to earn your food, and he prepared them for all of the pitfalls and all that stuff. So that was super interesting. So right after that is when we get into chapter 11. And this is where Jesus is told that John the Baptist is in prison, and some of John's disciples come to Jesus and they inquire about Jesus. What signs, are you the one?
Yeah.
And so... Jesus tells them, listen, here's what you tell John, right? And then they leave. Then Jesus takes some time to preach to the crowds about John. And I thought that was pretty interesting. Again, one of the observations I've been noticing, Kevin, and we talked about this offline, is how often Jesus is teaching us to be mindful of having a heavenly mindset versus a carnal, worldly mindset.
Yeah.
And he does it here even in the teaching about John.
Yep.
And he says that among men born of women, John is the greatest.
Yeah.
Greatest of all.
Yep.
He's the GOAT, right?
Yeah. And, it seems like it's this clear idea that, he is this prophet, right? He says, what did you go to see, a prophet? Yes, more than a prophet, right? And that idea there is he's the one, all these people have been pointing forward towards, the Messiah is coming, the Messiah is coming, the Messiah is coming.
Yeah.
And he was one who got to say, there he is.
Yeah,
right?
he's here.
He's here. He saw him, right? But you're right. Even still in that, I think you had said something to the effect of, he also does not get to see the fulfillment of those promises, right? He's going to get killed here before, right?
In our app that I had made.
Yeah, that'll pop up here in the next couple of chapters, right? Here he is. We see this conversation his disciples have with Jesus, and then he says, go tell him. And then shortly after that, he's going to be executed. And so, he didn't get to see those things fulfilled either, right? Yeah, he didn't get to enter into the kingdom like some of these did.
Yeah.
You do see this sort of setup here, and we'll see it more as we go. But it's continually popping up. The kingdom of heaven is like this, and we'll see it even in here in verse 11, right? The least in the kingdom is greater than this, right?
Which is crazy. John the Baptist is the greatest of all time,
right?
Yet,
right,
the least person in the kingdom of heaven,
right,
is greater than he.
Yeah, and I think your point about because he's under that old covenantal system, right? That's kind of the distinction of that he's drawing there, which is going to become evident to them later, I assume.
Yeah.
But certainly, I'm curious how that must have struck them, right? Like the people that are listening to it, right? That whoa, and I think his point is, how great is the kingdom of heaven then? Like that's what they're probably supposed to get out of it. How great is the kingdom of heaven then, right?
Well, forever the Israelites have esteemed their forefathers. They put a lot of stock in Abraham and Moses and Elijah and all of the prophets of old and these great men. And Jesus comes along and says, hey, John the Baptist was greater than all of those guys.
Yeah.
Right? And they're like, oh, yes, he was amazing. And then he says, yeah, but he's nothing compared to anybody in the kingdom of heaven. So it's just super interesting that we take it for granted that we're also members of the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
We have taken up the mantle of being in that family, in that kingdom. And the kingdom is now, not the kingdom that sometimes we think about the kingdom in terms of future tense.
That's right.
The kingdom is now, and we are citizens of it now.
Yep.
We may not be able to fully realize all of the amazing benefits of being in the eternal aspect of the kingdom, but we are certainly not lesser citizens in any way. We're citizens now.
That's right, and I think that's evident not here in the gospel so much, but we'll look at these other ideas in the New Testament where look, Jesus is king. Right here, we will see some of it in the Gospels where the prophecy, right? Whose son is he? Whose son is the Christ, son of David? Well, then how come he says, the Lord said to my Lord? And he points to, sit here on my right hand till I make your enemy, right? So he's saying, Jesus is king, right? We will say that. Well, if he's king, then he's king of what? He's going to be king of a kingdom, right? Otherwise, he's not king. And so, the king is now. I was struck, and I didn't really notice it on previous readings, how when he's talking to these people, right now, at this time, it doesn't look like his disciples are with them. He sent the disciples out. He's preaching in their towns as well. Right, and so near as I can tell, John's disciples come to him. He sends back, go see what you've observed. Now go back and tell him. Then he turns to the crowd and says here, right? So I don't think the disciples are present. But when you get down to verse 14 of chapter 11, he says, and if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come. Right, so they were expecting that before the Messiah was going to be the return of Elijah, right? Mm-hmm. And he says, this is him. Later, we're going to get the disciples asking, right? Well, how does it say then that Elijah was supposed to come first, and then he has to tell them, right? John was Elijah, right? Elijah has come, and they figure out, he's speaking of John,
you
right?
Missed that day of class.
Yeah, you weren't here when I made that clear, apparently, right? So I'm like, that's kind of interesting that these other people knew, and the other disciples come later and go, what about Elijah? Oh, sorry, he did come, and then they go, oh, John, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So I also found it interesting that it's seemingly out of the blue. I don't really know any context for why Jesus denounces this particular region. He mentions Chorazim, Bethsaida, and Capernaum because they did not repent.
Yeah, and it's got to be this thing because as he began to denounce the towns where most of his miracles had happened, right? So it's places that he's been and doing miracles, and the response of them, right? The response of those cities was not to turn from their sin. So my suspicion is, right, as we go back to the top of the chapter there, he went and to preach and teach them in their towns. That this is where those things are happening, right? That in their towns, in those places that he's just been. This is not a different time. He may be in Chorazin at this time, right? He may be in Bethsaida at this time, and he's speaking this thing, right? That woe to you because, and again, it's that same idea as before. We had the least in the kingdom is greater than John, right? And here we have one greater than is here. One greater than is here, right?
And then he says because they didn't repent. Yeah. Then he says, if the mighty works done there were done in Tyre and Sidon and even Sodom,
that's right,
they would have repented.
Yeah, right.
So he makes this great contrast that, hey, you better pay attention.
The things you're seeing here that are happening in this place have not happened in the history of the world, right?
Correct.
And it is such a thing that, we often think, what's the worst place you can imagine, right? And everything always Sodom and Gomorrah. Right, like it's kind of the go-to. And what really happened there as far as signs were concerned? They tried to go into the house and the angels struck them blind, I guess. And then shortly after that, they were all wiped out, right? And he's saying the type of signs, if these signs, the healing of people and the casting out of demons and the feeding of multitudes, and if these things had been done in there, they would have gone, whoa, we got to turn it around, right?
Yeah.
And you're not. And so it's a striking thing to say. You're worse than Sodom, right?
Yeah. Oof. It's crazy. Yeah. So right after that, Jesus says a prayer. And it seems like he's preaching, maybe?
Yeah.
It's because he's obviously speaking to the Father, but he's doing it in a way where people are being edified and taught a lesson.
Yeah, and I like that lesson in there, right? Because it's kind of fitting with the theme, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a little more as well. This theme that Matthew's building up of the contrast between the religious elites of his day, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the rest, right? Yeah. And so here he's saying, it's almost like he's telling us this theme in case you've missed it, and he's going to expand more on it, that you have hidden these things, right? These things about the kingdom, these things about who John really is. You've hidden these things from the wise and the discerning, and you've revealed them to infants, right? And we're going to get more of that, I think, in a minute too, where he talks about like the parables, right? And why do you teach in parables, and why do you do this thing? And so there's this idea that he's kind of setting up right here that we've seen happen in different accounts, the centurion, this kind of thing, when he goes off into the Decapolis, right, and casts out the demons. That's to a Gentile. He does these things. And then we're going to see more of it, as you pointed out, in a little later, right? The faithful Canaanite woman who comes. We'll see more of that, and in the parables themselves, that this is a theme he's letting you know right here. And Jesus is telling you that the wise and discerning have not seen, and yet the infants, the children have, right?
Yep. We also points out there that all access to the Father is through the Son.
Yeah.
And then he says, he gives this invitation, come to me.
Right.
He says, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for my burden is light.
Yeah.
My yoke is easy, my burden is light. We sing a song about that.
Yep.
And I will give you rest.
Yeah. All
you who labor, come to me, and you will have it way better. Again, speaking, not necessarily of physical, worldly benefits, but speaking about eternal rest, eternal peace, eternal, lack of burdens and heavy ladenness and all those things,
Yeah, so. And he's going to tie that, Matthew's going to tie that as well right into the next chapter, right? Which, again, we might have read on separate days, I don't remember now. And, chapter-wise are broken. But immediately after he says, right, hey, come to me, all you who labor, and I will give you rest, the very next vignette story that he's going to choose to tell is, at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath.
Yeah.
And his disciples became hungry, and so he's going to immediately contrast that with the Sabbath rest, right? He's going to immediately contrast it with the old law rest, right?
Yeah.
And how that plays out. And then he's going to say in verse 8, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, right? So why can I give you rest? Because I am the Lord of the Sabbath, right? And so he's going to immediately, Matthew's going to set that up immediately as he draws that contrast. And we have to remember, right?
I didn't make that connection. That's awesome.
But you have to remember that these writers, no one is telling you a day-by-day, play-by-play account.
Right.
Unless he says, and on the next day, right? Unless he says that, there's no reason to assume, he says, at that time, right? At what time? A week later? 6 days later? A month later? I mean, the disciples are out teaching. Jesus is teaching. They come back at some point, right? There could be months, right? Weeks between the end of 11 and the start of 12. Yet Matthew's going to say, and let me tell you this next story that I'm going to put right here. Why? There's a reason why he puts it there. He's drawing the connection between I will give you rest because I am Lord of Sabbath, right?
Yep.
And so he's laying that out very clearly. That's kind of what's going on. And the reaction of the people, again, the reaction that the religious leaders have to that is what, right? Why do they break the traditions? They're going against the law. It is bad that they do these things. And that whole chapter is like that. Jesus will do something good, and the religious elites of his day will turn it into something bad, right? He will cast out a demon, and the Pharisees will say what? Oh, he only does it by the prince of demons, right? Yeah. That's why. Everything that he does, they will then turn it into something else, right? Which, again, just goes back to showing that sort of the things that are inside me, which that's coming up too, I think, right? The things that go in are not what defile a man, it's the things that come out, because it reveals the heart, right? It demonstrates what the heart is about.
So I found it pretty interesting. So Matthew just points out in these like brief little moments where Jesus heals lots of people.
Right, multitudes,
multitudes of people. Like, can you imagine like the death rate in that area, just like
plummeting
for a long time, way down for who knows how long. All these people that cured their diseases and everything. But then he orders them again not to make him known. And you and I offline, we were talking about the fact that Jesus is controlling the timeline. He knows the end game. He knows how things are supposed to be lined up in order for his time to be right. And so it can be puzzling at times to think about, well, why wouldn't Jesus let people
let everyone know, right? Yeah, right.
Didn't he come so that everybody would know?
Yeah.
Well, yes, but it had to be right. It had to be the right time. The disciples needed to have time to learn everything that Jesus needed them to learn. The people of Israel had to have enough time to be taught about the Messiah, the Christ, that was prophesied to them for thousands of years. And we see the contrast between Jesus preaching only to the lost sheep of Israel.
Yeah.
We're going to see that in a little bit. And so Jesus is focused. He's got a focus and a plan. And so he says, listen, I'm going to heal you, but don't go spreading the word right now. Then you have this prophecy in Isaiah that Matthew is quoted being fulfilled right there in Matthew 12. This Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 3 reads, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I will put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice." And so we see here that he will not cry aloud or lift up his voice in the street or make it heard in the street.
Yeah.
That's part of the prophecy about Isaiah is that, listen, the time's going to be right. Jesus he doesn't want to be inundated with thousands and thousands and thousands of people, or necessarily the people in charge of the world, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we have to remember, and I try to make this point as any time I get it, is that Jesus doesn't show up on earth and one day walk down into the center of town and climb up on the cross.
No.
Right? That's not how it works. He has to manipulate events in such a way so that people will execute them. Right? So things he's doing are to make that happen. And also, he has a timeline on which he wants that to happen. So he has to sort of escalate and cool the temperature and control these things in such a way, right, to get it to the right time. And how does he do that? He does it through the things he does, the places he goes, that when he tells people don't proclaim, and when he tells them go tell everybody, right? He does these things to move the clock appropriately. And that just kind of speaks to me to the power that God has. I mean, we see it in other stories in the Old Testament and things, his power over world events and but Jesus expertly, masterfully controls the timeline of people and how they respond and turning up the political temperature and getting the right, so that he will get crucified when he wants at the Passover. When he's done with all the other things he needs to do with his disciples and spreading the gospel and all those things, right, and laying the foundation for what's going to become the church, when he does that and he makes that happen by the decisions he makes in his life to play to that end game. And that just speaks to a foresight and a power that we don't have, right? Boggles the mind.
Yeah, so when you were talking, it reminded me of the book of Daniel.
Yeah.
When Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And it's in Daniel chapter 2, if you guys want to look that up. But right down in verse 31 and following, Daniel reveals the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, not having been told it by anybody. So not only does
not even know the dream, yeah.
Right. So through God, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was. And then he said, this is the interpretation of it.
Yeah.
And this dream was about this statue, made of these multiple layers of different materials and gold and iron and stone and all these things. And then he says, there's going to became a great mountain. The stone that struck the image, right, became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Right? So he's talking about the future of the kingdoms to come, including Nebuchadnezzar's first kingdom.
Yeah.
And so this little stone that comes and destroys all of that is basically speaking about Christ. God knew ahead of time what was going to happen, what needed to take place.
Yeah.
All of these things had to be in place in the right time. And so you see all of these very specific prophecies about the timing of Jesus. It's pretty amazing.
There's even more, which are, again, somewhat controversial as far as how they're interpreted. But, I mean, Daniel 9 is even more specific. I mean, he lays out this, here is the message of the 70 weeks, right?
Yeah.
And he tells them
Yeah.
that this has something to do with, right, the people, the holy city, the ending of transgression, us bringing sin to an end, to atone for iniquity, and to bring everlasting righteousness, right? And to anoint the Holy of Holies. So he's telling you this is about the coming Messiah, right? Mm-hmm. And it's very specific. Now, how you interpret that is a little tricky, but God knew, and Jesus knew, and he figured out how, right? Jesus is making sure that timeline matches up to whatever it is that God wanted. He's making sure that timeline plays out to that level of specificity, right?
Yeah.
It's quite impressive that we often just overlook.
Yeah, it's crazy. But we are often, as we study through the scriptures, you and I both talk about how often we are awestruck in just the vast awesomeness of God and His knowledge and His ability to just plan through history, through the events of man, and execute His will through it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. So later in chapter 12, as we're moving on, we talked about, one of the famous quotes by Jesus, a house divided against itself cannot stand.
After
Military
the accusation,
leaders,
yeah.
people use that all the time in secular wisdom.
Yeah.
But that's from Jesus. He said that himself.
And certainly Jesus is using that secular wisdom to make his point, right? Because they don't go, wait, what are you talking about, right? They understood. It's a common sort of thing to understand.
Yep.
Right.
So chapter 13, Jesus starts diving into some parables. We have a lot of parables in chapter 13. Parable of the sower, which we've spent a lot of time talking about that in church and circles. So I don't think we should spend much time on that. Then we have the parable, the purpose of parables. We mentioned that a little bit. Those that are actually seeking the truth will be able to understand it.
Yeah.
Those unwilling to see and hear will never have understanding.
Yeah, and that's an important thing that I think we get wrong a lot of times, and that is, we oftentimes will say that the purpose of the parables was to reveal more clearly heavenly truths, right? That, the kingdom of heaven is like, and he tells a story, right? And so the idea is, let me help you understand more with the kingdom. It's a metaphor that's helpful in explaining, right? But the Gospels make the exact opposite point, right? When they ask him, why is it that you speak in parables? In verse 10, in verse 11, he says, because to you has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For this reason I speak in parables, because seeing they do not see and hearing they do not hear and do not understand, right? And so in such the prophecy of Isaiah will be fulfilled. They're hearing, but they don't hear. They see, but they don't see, right? Lest they turn and I heal them. And so the point he makes is the purpose of the parables was not so much to reveal the truth, but to conceal it, which is quite interesting, right? It is quite a striking thing for him to say that, no. The reason I don't just come out and say what I want to say, look, could Jesus have come up with a way that he could use and explain any spiritual truth he wanted to without telling a parable story? Of course he could have, right? Yeah. And so he says, the reason I choose to do this is to hide it from those who don't want to hear and don't want to see. So those people who want to come and kill me, those people who are oppositional to me, they can't point to it and say, well, he said this. He can be like, I told a story about a sower. I told a story about harvesting the wheat. I told a story about, right? And so he's intentionally concealing it from those. And there's a strong connection here to something we talked about in Hebrews, right? Because over in Hebrews, there's this warning about, at this time you should have, and I'd like to talk to you more about Melchizedek when he gets to the end of a chapter, but you've become dull of hearing, right? You're not mature like you ought to be. You don't have your senses exercised. Well, why are you dull of hearing? That sounds like something I heard Jesus say, right? And there's a danger there. You're dull of hearing because you've shut your eyes. You don't want to listen. You don't want to hear.
Absolutely. Just as you were talking, I wonder the cryptic nature of the book of Revelation, the way it was laid out. Some people I've heard it taught that it was just cryptic enough for anybody just picking it up without any context,
right?
Would not
have know.
We're like, okay, I don't get it, whatever. Yeah, right. And so, but the people who it was written for and to, they would understand exactly everything that was intended. So there's definitely some of that. I personally believe that the Book of Revelation was intended to be written that way, specifically because of the persecution that was
things that are going on.
But in terms of Jesus using this language, almost the same reason. If he's trying to make sure that the powers that be that don't want to understand or to unlearn the truths that they hold dear, truths meaning the things that they think are true. So so we have all these parables. We have the parable of the sower. We have the parables of the weeds. Where the good and the bad weeds grow up together, and the harvest time comes, and the master says, "We just wait, let them grow up together." At the end,
we'll deal with it in the harvest.
We're going to separate them out, burn the bad ones, the good ones go to the barn, right? The mustard seed and leaven. And we just talked about it. No teaching was done without a parable.
Yeah.
Parable of the hidden. So we have all these little series of parables talking about the kingdom.
Right. It's like a fine pearl. It's like a treasure buried in a field. It's
Yep.
like, yeah.
Yep. And then, of course, the parable of the net. They sort the fish at the end.
That's right.
And then Jesus goes to Nazareth, and a prophet is not
Yeah,
worthy
not
in his
received in
own
his own
town.
synagogue,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah. So rejected in his own hometown. And then tragedy strikes.
Yeah.
In chapter 14.
And there's that thing we talked about, right? We're going to see John, and then we're going to get him again. And the next time we see him, it's because news has come back that he's Herod the Tetrarch has executed him.
Yeah.
Right. And the response to that is interesting again in Matthew. That sort of speaks this humanity, right? John's disciples came and told him, and they took the body or to bury it, and they came and told it to Jesus. And then the very next thing is, now when Jesus heard this, so it's clearly that this is not just on the next day, or Matthew just put it in this way. He's telling us this is the response, right? When Jesus heard this, he went away from there privately to an isolated place, right? And so Jesus's intent is to
Go and mourn
and deal with the grief and what, right? So there's this human aspect here that this is a family member, right? This is his cousin. And this is someone who he's close to. This is someone who he certainly, even if not those things, is a great prophet of God, someone he would respect and hold dear for the work he's done for the work of God, right? But the people find out where he is and they go follow him. And that also kind of speaks to this, why does Jesus sometimes say, hey, don't tell people, don't whatever? Because otherwise, this is what happens, right? He can never get away. He can never do things. There's another story where he tells them, don't tell, and they go and tell. And then there's such just massive people that descend on the city that, whatever work he was trying to get done there can't get done. It just hinders the work, right? So you see that here happening as well.
Well, I'm also touched by the fact that while Jesus was wanting to mourn, he was able to overcome his own personal desires.
Yeah, when they come, he has compassion on them,
He had
right?
compassion on these people, right? Mm-hmm. So it's just how amazing Jesus is and how much compassion and empathy and sympathy and kindness did he have just pouring out of him all the time.
And this goes right back again to, like we said in Hebrews, right? That he's a great high priest who can empathize with our weaknesses, right? Because he understands through the things that he himself suffered, right?
Exactly.
He went through these things. He understands. He understands grief and loss, right? Because his people and his family died, right? He suffered these things just like you do.
Well, so he tries to mourn. He does mourn the one day.
Yeah.
But then he has to work again. And then after feeding the 5,000, which was a crazy miracle, he sends the disciples away again, and he goes up to the mountain to pray by himself until evening. So then he's like, well, they're really far out there. I can't really
just walk out there and
I'll just go out there and meet them. So there he goes. Like, he walks on the water all the way. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about.
And I think there's a lot of lessons and stories there, but I don't want to deal too much with them now because they're more explicitly brought out in some of the other Gospels.
Yep. Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll get to them as we continue reading.
Yeah, he certainly does. But you had mentioned before about just the number of people that were being healed. Right, and there's a good example of this at the very end of that chapter. They come over, they land at Gennesaret, and when they heard, the whole surrounding shows up, and anyone who just touches him, right? Anyone who just touches his garment are healed or cured, right? And so we see how many people were healed by Jesus in his time on earth. I mean, we have a couple of stories, but if you actually tried to count, you'd be like, how many do you count there? Right? How many is all the surrounding region who were sick, right? I don't know. Thousands of people were
it's crazy.
Impacted.
So we get into chapter 15, right after healing in Gennesaret.
Yeah.
And we had a comment from our brother Nathan. He said this. He said, more of Jesus' teachings, which impresses on me the importance of understanding that what comes out of me is a reflection of what is inside. And so it's a really good reminder that, you have these lessons through 15, but that the things that defile a man is about what comes out of you is a reflection of your real heart.
That's right. And so the idea there is, like we saw previously, right, that the things that are inside you is what comes out. The man who is learned in the knowledge of the kingdom brings out treasures, both new and old, right, from the good things which he has stored up. And here, right, from a evil heart you bring out evil things. When they come and they say, and we've seen this already in this week's reading when he says, when they accuse him of casting out demons by the prince of demons, and he says, listen, either make the tree good and its fruit good, right, or make the tree evil and its fruit evil. And that's, again, all these teachings about it's the things inside that reflect outside, right? And these things inside is what's defiling you. Here is some different ways you do that, right? It's not what goes into the mouth that makes man unholy, but what comes out. And I like when he says that, how in verse 12 his disciples say, do you know that the Pharisees took offense when you said this, right? Do you know you offended them? And his answer is, well, if they were offended, it's because they weren't planted by my Father, right? Now, they're not around at this point, just his disciples are, right? But I wonder what they would have done if they heard that. Leave them alone. They're blind guides of the blind, right? They're both going to fall in the pit. They're not planted by my Father. They'll be uprooted, right? It's like, you want offense? Give me some offense. Right?
Give me some offense. You want to know the real truth?
Yeah, right. Here, let me tell you about it.
Exactly.
And then they say, hey, explain this parable to us. And so that's another interesting thing, right? That just points to the parables were not so evidently clear, because all the time the disciples, the ones who have ears to hear, right, they come and they say, hey, what do you mean by that? And then he has to explain it to them, right? This is what the parable means. And so certainly there's this clear picture. The parables are concealing truth. And then he reveals it to whom he will, like he said before, right? I know the Father, and the only one who knows the Father is me, and to those to whom the Son of Man chooses to reveal him to him. And then right after that where he says, come unto me, right? And so now here we have it, right? There's this parable. They don't understand. Do they walk away? Or do they come unto Jesus and say, hey, explain to us the meaning? We have ears to hear. We want to know what it means. And then he tells them, right? So it really is about what's in the heart. What do I want to know? If I want to know, Jesus tells them. He just lets them know.
He started that way back in the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, right.
When he says, knock and the door will be
open. Knock and be open, right? Ask and it'll find. Right? Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it says that you have to have the heart of a truth seeker.
Right.
I am truth.
Yeah. And so he plays that out right here, right in this story.
So we won't spend too much time about the elevated traditions versus the Word of God, which we see there. But the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they're trying to test Jesus. And they're like, hey, why don't you follow the traditions? And this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So that's just a warning for us, a continual warning for us, that sometimes we hold great stock in the way we've always done a thing, and sometimes there's a risk for us to elevate a tradition up to the same level as one of God's commands. So
and that's really interesting there too, because the thing he says there is a citation, which means that's not a new thing. Isaiah said that. Right? And what's a little bit interesting is if you go read in Isaiah, it reads slightly differently. Because in Isaiah, it basically reads, they draw near to me with their mouth, their hearts, they honor with their lips, so their hearts is far from me. And their fear of me is a commandment taught by men. Right? So it's not that they teach as doctrine the commands of men. What he says there is the only reason they fear God is because they've been told to. Right, which is an interesting sort of slight distinction there in the Isaiah and the way then that Jesus applies that over there.
So one of the things that you and I spoke about on before in our prep was this little section here in chapter 15 where this Canaanite woman comes out of nowhere and approaches Jesus. So we have this little section here where this woman, her daughter is ill. She has faith that Jesus can heal her, and she's boldly seeking his attention, and he ignores her.
Yeah, and in fact his disciples have to say, could you send this woman away?
They're like, come on, this lady's really annoying.
She just keeps following us around, right?
Can you just send her away?
Yeah.
And he finally responds, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.
Yeah.
He didn't say that to the centurion. As you pointed out at the very beginning, the wise men that came from the east were probably Gentile.
Yeah.
So God has always been totally fine with using Gentiles. And so the more I really kind of meditate on this and think about it, I really think he was just testing her.
Yeah, it could be, right, that he is doing that. And certainly he could also just be saying, my mission, my time, my thing is to do these sorts of things. And yet you also have to consider where he is. Yeah. Right? This is not a Canaanite woman who approaches him in Jerusalem. He's in Tyre and Sidon. right? Like, why is he in the region of Tyre and Sidon if his mission is only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, right? Now, certainly there were Jews who were dispersed all over, right? So he's preaching there perhaps to the lost sheep of Israel. I mean, if you're in Tyre and Sidon, you're probably one of the lost sheep of Israel, right? If you're a Jew and you're living in Tyre and Sidon. And so, but then she comes along and he's like, hey, that's not what I'm here for. I'm not here for you. I'm here for these lost sheep. And but her statement certainly shocks him. And it's not shock is maybe not the right word. Because, I don't want to say that Jesus is surprised by things, right? But he is astounded by it, right?
Amazed a little,
Yeah. Oh, woman, great is your faith.
Yeah.
Right. That I would basically say no because it is not for you. And you would come back not only with, I'm still going to keep pushing, but a wise thing, right? Wise thing that, yes, that is true. But even I'm a dog, right? I'm a dog compared to you and compared to these people you're teaching and compared to whatever. I'm a dog, and yet even dogs eat from the scraps that fall from the table. Right? Just give me a scrap and it will be sufficient. Right? A scrap of your power is sufficient to do what I ask. Right? And he's like, oh, woman, I'm amazed. Right? Like, let it be done as you have said. Right? Let it be done as you have said.
But, when we read this, our culture kind of cringes a little.
Sure.
We cringe a little when we read this, but she didn't necessarily take offense.
Nope.
The way an American would take offense.
Sure, right.
We would be justified in our anger and our
calling it a dog, right? What? Yes.
Right. It would go viral as something the Christian man said, right?
Right.
But it's astounding to me that you see this woman, you also see the centurion, who equally, and you also see Rahab the harlot, right, in Jericho.
Yeah.
3 prime examples of people who weren't in the inner circle of God's people, who recognize who the authority is, seek the authority, praise the authority, and humble themselves to seek their wisdom and their guidance and their special attention.
Yep.
And so it's a great story.
Yeah.
Great story. But I really do. I lean towards him testing her.
He's just seeing, right? Well, what are you going to do here, right? What are you going to do here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She had enough faith, obviously, to just approach him anyway.
To come in the first place.
And she was
and to follow him around for who knows how long, right?
Yeah. All right, so that's a great lesson. So after that, Jesus heals 4,000. He says again, I have compassion on the crowd.
Yeah.
All right. We've had a couple of cups where the sign of Jonah is mentioned by Jesus.
Yeah. And, we're running short on time here. Like I said, there's so much stuff.
Bit.
But, yeah, this sign of Jonah thing is interesting because it's curious the thing they ask for, and the answer he gives is basically something when you interpret it and understand it is this thing that's after the fact, right? I mean, it's the best way to put it. I'll give you a sign. It's going to be after I die and am resurrected, right? Okay, yeah. I guess, right? But what's strange about that is he then even says to them, you're good at reading the signs. Why can't you read this sign? The only sign I will give you is the sign of Jonah, so they're supposed to understand it. And he leaves and goes away.
Yeah.
Right? And it's just like, what? And it's not till later we understand what's going on. It gets told to us in other Gospels as well. That's what he means by that. And so certainly there might be this idea that was suggested that, what is the sign of Jonah? Right? The sign of Jonah is that Jonah goes and he speaks to a people and they do what?
They
repent, right?
They're the enemies of God.
They're the enemies of God and they repent, right? And yet these people who he is here speaking to, so this could be what he's also saying, I'm here speaking to you, and what are you not doing? Repenting.
You're not repenting.
So guess what? Let me tell you about the sign of Jonah, right? Maybe you're, like in those previous things. If the things that had been done in the days of Jonah had been done here, right? In fact, something less was done. A guy just showed up, right, and preached, and yet you have signs and wonders done, and you will not, right? So, woe unto you if Jonah will rise up in this day and say, right? That kind of a thing, yeah.
So 17, we see another leveling up of the antagonism between the Pharisees and Sadducees. He calls them an evil and adulterous generation. Then he talks about the sign of Jonah. That's what we're talking about there. Then Jesus asks, "Hey, my disciples are finally returned to me at this point. Who do the people say that I am?" He says, and some people, some people say Elijah, some John the Baptist, some Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. And then Jesus says, "Well, who do you say that I am?"
Yeah.
And, I don't know, it was just Peter that knew the answer, or if he was just the older one that we kind of maybe do we speak about
first
that
to speak.
online?
We didn't online.
Okay,
Yeah. I don't think it's shown up yet. Yeah,
we'll get there yet. Or if just Peter just bold, he's
always the first to open his mouth, right? So,
he's always the one
Yeah.
with the answer. But Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God."
Right.
And a few verses later, Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan."
Yeah. After he starts predicting his resurrection, right, or his
Yeah.
death, he says, "That's
but-
not going to happen, right? We're never going to let you get killed, right?"
Yeah, this whole little section there, blessed are you, Peter, upon this rock, meaning upon
Right.
that statement itself, I'm going to build my church based on. That's the foundation of my church, that
Right.
I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. Right? And then Jesus says, and I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to die.
He says,
And
this
Peter
never
says,
happened to you.
"Whoa, no,
Right.
I don't think so."
Right.
And Jesus says, "You're a hindrance to me, Peter.
Right.
Get behind me." He calls him Satan.
Yeah.
Get behind me. Because that is the exact opposite of the will of God and my intentions and my will.
Yeah, and there's that theme again you've talked about, is it rooted in worldly things or heavenly things? And he says, your mind is not on the things of God, but on the things of man.
Right.
Right, there's your problem.
Yeah.
There it is, right? You've got the wrong perspective on what's going
Yeah.
on here. You're thinking like a man thinks and not as God thinks. You're thinking
Yeah.
about physical things here versus the mission that I've got. And then we'll get that statement. If you want to follow after me, you have to deny yourself, take up the cross, and follow me, right?
Yeah.
Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses it for my sake will find it, right? And so we're going to get that expansion there of that idea of the heavenly things and the earthly things. Are you rooted here or are you rooted in heaven? Where is your citizenship of your kingdom? Yep.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so chapter 17, we're going to go ahead and skip a lot of it because I know we will definitely cover the transfiguration in more detail in other Gospels.
Yeah.
But I wanted to talk about the temple tax from the fish.
Yeah.
That Jesus ends up paying. They get into town, and somebody comes up and says, "Hey, doesn't your teacher pay the tax?" And Jesus, later on says, "Hey, he tells them should the son have to pay the tax?"
Yeah, he makes a theological argument about I shouldn't have to, but
I shouldn't have to, but I will just because I don't want to cause any.
I don't want to cause a
troubles.
problem
I don't
anywhere,
want to cause
right?
a problem.
That's right. So yes, go do
He
it.
tells Peter, "Hey, go catch a fish.
Yeah.
The fish you catch."
Yeah.
It's going to have money in it.
It's going to have 4 coins in its mouth, right? Which is sufficient for your tax and for mine, right? And then you go pay the temple tax. Go catch that fish, open up, there'll be coins in his mouth.
And here's something that I had never heard until we talked about it today.
Yeah.
Go ahead and explain this little this observation and then subsequent question, and then maybe just go ahead.
Yeah,
Take it away.
There is some speculation, and again, it's that you can do with this what you want, but there's some speculation that the disciples of Jesus, right? If you think about them in your mind, how old are the apostles and how old is Jesus? You're probably like, well, they're like peers, right? They're all in their 30s, right? That's probably what first thought comes to mind. You've never really thought about it, right? And so you just assume, well, how old are my friends I hang around with, right? They're my age. There's some speculation that the disciples may be considerably younger than Jesus is, right? That Jesus is in his 30-ish range. We usually assume between 30 and 33, right? Based on some Julian calendar suspect math. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But that these disciples may be in their teens. They may be considerably younger than Jesus. And the reasons for that are, one, disciples would usually follow a rabbi who's older than them, not someone who's their same age, right? That's not typically how rabbi-disciple relationships worked. Secondly, the only one who's ever said to have a wife is Peter. So, wait, there's all these 30-year-old men running around Jesus who don't have spouses? That would be weird in Jewish society, right? And the third piece of evidence is this story, because it says Jesus and his disciples show up in town, and he says, go pay the tax only for you and me, Peter. Is that just because Peter came and asked, so the other disciples got exempted, or is there another reason? And so what people have suggested is, if you go back and you look at the law, and this is in Exodus chapter 30, verses 13 through 16, so if anyone wants to look this up. In Exodus 30, 13 to 16, we have the establishment here of the census and this tax, right? Each one who's numbered in the census will give this, half a shekel according to the shekel of the sanctuary. Half a shekel is an offering to the Lord. Everyone who's numbered in the census from 20 years old and upward shall give the Lord's offering. The rich will not give more, the poor will not give less. Half shekel is what you give to the Lord to make an atonement for your lives, right? And so this thing, it'll be given for the service of the tent of meeting, da 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 da. So this establishment of this temple tax, if this is what it's talking about, was paid by those males of Israel who were 20 years old and up. So some have suggested, okay, maybe Peter and Jesus are the only ones older than 20, and the other disciples are less than that. You can do with that with what you want, but it's an interesting insight when you kind of put all those things together. That
it really is, and
maybe
it
that's what's
does
going on
actually
here.
it does
Yeah.
make a lot of sense why John was faster than Peter as well, because maybe Peter was a little
Years old. Yeah. See, you ever try and run against a teenager? Man, they're quick, right? Yeah. But it's something people have speculated on, and you go, it's neither here nor there, but it's
I never heard that. It's
interesting.
It makes sense.
And it would also explain a little bit sometimes why you're like, why don't these guys don't get it? And I'm like, because they're teenagers.
Yeah.
You ever try to teach teenagers? I do it every day. They're dumb. They don't pick things up very quick, right? Like that may be what's literally going on. It may be as simple as that. But we don't have that information. But in your own head canon, if you want to speculate on it, it's
Yep. So the last thing we should probably deal with just real quick is this idea about forgiveness, which we see a lot of in chapter 18.
yeah.
Let's wrap up with this idea of forgiveness. And I was pulling up our app today.
Yeah.
And just as a reminder, if you've made it this far in the podcast, obviously you're invested in paying attention and listening to us. But there's a lot of us that are joined in on the YouVersion Bible app in the plan itself. And there's probably, 12 or 15 people, not a ton. So, but one of our brothers, Nathan, mentioned him last week. He's just really great at adding some insightful things. My wife Megan's been making some comments, and Kevin and I are on there as well. So we'd love for you to join in and just give us your 2 cents. But Nathan today, regarding forgiveness, he mentioned being contingent on our forgiving. So simple until what was wronged you really hurts.
Right.
So it sounds real easy.
Forgive others, you'll be forgiven, right?
No problem. I got that, right?
Yeah.
Until somebody really, really, really hurts you. And then it's hard.
Yeah.
Right? And then Megan says it, or when you care deeply about the person who has wronged you. Mm-hmm. So if you have this really deep relationship with somebody and they've hurt you, it's very difficult to forgive. And, there's a lot to unpack about forgiveness. And I just put in there, in my experience, sometimes it takes time for that healing process to take place before we really feel that we've forgiven somebody. And I know that's not necessarily what the Bible's teaching us, that we don't have to wait for confirmation of our feelings. We're supposed to. The ideal that Jesus is teaching here is that forgiveness is something that we should be doing readily and willingly, and readily and willingly, no matter what. And it reminds me of some of the ideals that Jesus points to at the beginning of his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. Although you've heard it said. You've heard it said that you shall not murder. But I say, if you even have hate in your heart for somebody, it's just like murdering them. The ideal about love and divorce and all these things that Jesus points to, that's the intent of God. And we're supposed to strive towards that intent, but it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. And forgiveness is one of those things.
Yeah, certainly, right. But the importance of it cannot be overstated.
No.
Right. If you just want to put yourself into the position of and this is what I try to remember, what if God treated you like you're treating them? Right? What if when you came to ask forgiveness for God, God was like, yeah, man, I don't know, you really did something really bad. Or really, again, this is the 7th time, right? I can't forgive you anymore. Or hey, the amount of things that you did, right? You owe 100 pence, right? Versus 10,000 talents versus the smaller amount. And so if we act like that, and Jesus acted like that, what would be the result? And that kind of helps me remember. Okay, I guess I better do that.
Well, I also think when Jesus starts in this section, he starts by epitomizing the child. If whoever humbles himself like this child, right? Unless you do, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. And when you think about children, how often will we see one kid hurt another kid's feelings, and almost immediately after they're done crying, they're back playing again?
Yeah, right. Yeah, they're over it. Right.
It's like, okay, whatever.
They don't really hold grudges. Yeah.
No. not when they're young and innocent. Why is it that as we get older, we learn how to do that? This holding of grudges.
Yeah, and I think, if you're asking my opinion on that, is that it's a human self-preservation technique, right? It's I don't want to get hurt again.
Mm-hmm.
So I've learned to buffer and isolate myself in certain ways by doing that, right? And again, you just better be glad that God doesn't say, I'm tired of people hurting me, so I'm going to stop forgiving them, right? They just keep hurting me and wronging me every day, all the time, so forget it, right? I'm done with them. Because, he did that once in the flood, right? I'm done with these people. I'm going to wipe them out. That's it, right?
Yeah.
And so certainly he could decide to do that again, but he doesn't. He doesn't. And so we should be glad that that's the way he behaves and operates.
Absolutely. Well, I don't even know what
is out of time anymore.
What is out of time anymore? But
right.
we're under an hour.
Yeah, it's good,
right?
Yeah.
But listen, there's obviously so much more that we could spend our time talking about. It's been a great week reading through, and I hope I've got the audio kind of dialed in a little bit better. Have you been able to listen to it, Kev?
I haven't listened back yet to see what it sounds like. I'll have to do that and double check on it and see how it sounds.
Yeah, you gotta chime in. I'm giving you credit every day. I put your name on the reading, so you need
well, I'm doing the reading, and I click through on the app. I can show you on my app that it's checking me off, right? But
it's just me being lazy. I don't want to have to recreate the thumbnail more than once a week,
right.
So. But no, it's been really great. The book of Matthew is the story of Jesus, and all the things we have to learn is so vitally important for us as Christians today. So with that, we'll sign off. Any last words for the week, Kev?
No, yeah, I think if you've made it this far, good job. We're 2 weeks in there. Keep strong. You're getting right around quitting day, right? So let's not do that. Let's keep going.
Yeah,
and keep doing this.
And today, if you're listening to this podcast, today is our official catch-up day. So if you missed any days of the reading this week, well, just make sure you do. If you want to just hit the easy mode and just listen to it, you can either listen to it right in the app or listen to it by my boom voice.
Your dulcet tones.
Dulcet tones, yes. So, all right, that's it for everybody. God bless you, and we'll see you tomorrow.